We have sent enough back and forth to each other over the past week. It all started, of course, with the trade war, tariff war, and it continues this week, and there's plenty to talk about. The Romanians' economic changes indeed with those tariffs. In Russia, we again have a few things that make you wonder what's going on. German car factories that are coming into Chinese hands. Last week, we talked about energy, of course. This week, another cool update from the Netherlands. But let's get to the point. Let's start with where we might have spent the most time last week, and that is how America is messing with Europe. Can I say it like that?
Yes, but he's also messing with Canada, messing with Mexico, he's messing with the whole world. If you read his book, The Art of the Deal, it's been Trump's standard operating procedure for the past 30 years, so he's having conversations everywhere. And then getting people back together a little bit, that's fantastic. And that certainly helps on the world stage.
That is right. Last week, there was also the cryptocurrency summit at the White House. Yes, what did you all think of that?
But yes, if you want to attend a summit on this planet, then you're busy about 24 hours, 7 days a week. So there are so many summits happening at the moment. A few people are already attending. We'll see. I think it's good to see that crypto is becoming a bigger part of, it's one of the ways to store value, and that's now being more accepted. I feel that it is just good to observe.
Indeed, I share that perspective. Cryptocurrency was initially perceived as somewhat fringe, and that is no longer so natural. I found that message that the American government wants to start using crypto, I also found hamster quite special.
Yes, I must say, I find that a bit dangerous too. Look, Trump is not a foolish guy in that regard, and he knows that the national debt is enormously high and wants to use this as a vehicle to pay off that national debt a bit faster. Yes, what I expect is that he will really make a plaything of it in the sense that those prices, with all the bad news that Mr. Musk has shown several times in the past, can do that. To throw something out into the world and everyone panics and those prices plummet, they can hoard and it goes up and suddenly they've conjured money out of nowhere. Yes, let's be honest, if there's anything that central banks and governments get excited about, it's a vehicle to conjure money out of thin air. So that plaything on the one hand will drive up the price because they want it to, but it won't be the vehicle that becomes less volatile in the short run.
No, and couldn't this eventually lead to a push for government influence over the entire cryptocurrency phenomenon? A push like this is exactly what you don't want. Sure, you should check it out. Yes, exactly. And that's what we all really shouldn't want, I think. And you might see that now. That was my first reaction. Aha, they're trying to get a grip on that crypto market.
The counter argument is also that, for the first time, you're regulating something that you actually own yourself and therefore also know yourself what it is instead of saying, oh, we're going to regulate that a bit. We have no idea what you all are doing. Yes, here are some rules about that because you see that in many sectors. And you could also say that Trump is actually just making a brilliant move because he has to refinance quite a lot of the national debt in the next 6 months. What better than to bring the market down a bit so that you also get the interest rates down, allowing you to refinance the national debt more cheaply. What you see now is in the traditional market, but indeed also in the crypto market, everything has been quite corrected. And that does work in favor of the policy in Washington. The question is more indeed, now at this same moment, we are going to raise 800 billion for ReArm Europe, which makes me think, shouldn't you indeed lower your interest rates a bit before you start doing those kinds of things? But maybe there's some emotion involved. Maybe we'll talk about it later. But if you look at crypto, I happened to discuss it yesterday with a company we invest in, and they are involved in market making, in crypto market making. They also said if you look at the volume of the market recently, yes, it really just seems like retail investment. And then you wonder about all those trends of, well, institutional is back. Is it now? Now the market is becoming more stable? Like you said, that's not noticeable in the market.
Well, look, I agree that it's a very intelligent move by President Trump. I do agree with that part. Yes, it is indeed a zero-sum game in crypto where governments are winning, taking the money away from someone else for a moment. And that is often retail investors because they tend to be late and hold these positions for too long. So, in essence, it's just a disguised form of theft because they are going to dominate that market.
Land grab or tax because ultimately you reduce consumer spending and thereby the government's revenue.
It pretends not to raise taxes, but then you have an investment position.
This is somewhat what I think characterizes Trump, those zero-sum games as seen in the discussions about Greenland, the Panama Canal. But we'll get back to that when we talk about geopolitics. Also, the discussion regarding what is currently happening in the negotiations with Russia, at least what is being proposed, it could be brilliant what he is doing. But it could also result in a massive crash We'll get back to that in a moment, but I think the same about his crypto move. It could be brilliant. What you say, Rowan, that he indeed creates an instrument to actually tackle the national debt, which is certainly needed. I mean, we also wondered last time, how can it be that a country like America has such a debt? Is that sustainable?
The first doomsday predictors of the big crash, it's coming. Whether it's a brilliant move by Trump, we shall see. But of course, I don't know if you are familiar with street magic or sleight of hand. Sleight of hand is the art of making a lot of movement here so you can do something sneaky, and that's what Trump is doing at this moment on many fronts. A lesson for myself, too, on how you can ultimately get large crowds to move in a certain direction. We'll see if it goes in the right or wrong direction. Many economists, American economists, say there's a 50-50 chance. Some agree. I say, no, this is a correction. We'll see. We know better than anyone from the experiences of the past 30 years that it only takes a very small trigger or it just continues to rise nicely.
You can somewhat measure that by movements in the market, of course. You also saw this week that Binance secured an investment from Abu, $2 billion. It is an extreme amount for a crypto exchange. Again, at least that's what I gathered, that such a party thinks, oh well, volumes are going to increase on essentially an exchange that you can link to retail investors, I think. Mostly, at least, most of Binance's traffic is retail. Not all in Europe, because they are no longer allowed to trade for retail, though they can still trade institutionally. That is indeed a sign of where we might be heading.
Well, the UAE and the Abu Dhabi global markets, of course, have a very long-term strategy on their horizon. They want to make the Abu Dhabi global markets the capital of capital to attract small cap, mid cap, and large cap companies there. And they are fully committed to digital assets, and this is a strategic move for them. A few years ago, they brought Binance to the region, and this is simply a strategic move. Or it could have happened 6 months ago, but it's just a long-term strategy from those guys over there.
And even as the devil's advocate, I was thinking, how big is that 2 billion really? What exactly is Binance?
The entire crypto market is 2 trillion.
Yes.
A small beer, right? Yes, 2 billion is small beer.
Can you really find it? And yes, of course, Abu Dhabi is actually also a family office of the family. I think they have about 1.5 trillion in assets managed with the family.
Also received a new boat this week. I believe that thing is one of the largest boats in the world, so the family can enjoy themselves again.
Two brothers have a little island off the coast there, and it's not far from Jazz Arena, and they have a private island there to host the two ships. They have probably already taken that into account for the future.
They had factored that into their considerations to float. It's so different from Dubai. Everyone is, of course, very familiar with Dubai and how everything works there, and it's kind of the Las Vegas of the Middle East. Abu Dhabi is actually trying to profile itself a bit, maybe even as a Silicon Valley-like Middle Eastern region, but it's not working out that way.
They want to become more like the Switzerland of the Middle East.
Well, I do find Abu Dhabi to be a lot more serious than Dubai. Investment-wise, you've often talked about that too. It is not finished. And there are, of course, still plenty of opportunities. Abu Dhabi is much more up and coming, I think. At this moment, there are far more opportunities there. Great opportunities to do business, yes.
For Saudi.
Certainly to Saudi as well.
It is said to be the big fish. But then, guys, I find that an interesting proposition. But Mark, you come from Westerlink, Mark Zuns, Mark Dirk. You all come there regularly, of course. Has it got a bit of a 20s, 30s New York vibe? Middle East there?
When I was there, they are all family firms, which means they have long-term plans. They have a goal in sight. Some have been doing this for 20 or 35 years, and they have copied each other a lot. So it gets quite busy there. Yes, there is a lot of talk and a bit less quick execution. There are many vistas, but there are also many that make the story. We'll see. It's very crowded now. What Saudi wants to do with their vision in the 23rd, the first cracks with the line, they are already visible with NEOM.
The figure was initially 500 billion, but it has now unexpectedly been revealed that this week it will actually cost 8 trillion. Just a little math error.
Yes, well, go ahead and finance that. I find it a very special, admirable project. It's also very efficient when you consider how many people can live per square meter, thanks to the technology they apply. Of course, it's much more efficient when you build a city in 10 years. It's naturally more efficient to manage materials than if you do it over the same period as 50 years. I understand that. But yes, if you already consider how much concrete they need there in the desert, how many ships you would need to deliver that concrete there, it's simply unimaginable. Those ships aren't there yet, not even built.
In terms of scale, certainly. But otherwise, when I hear you say all those sentences, I think, okay, you're also describing the Bijlmer in Amsterdam when we first built it, just putting everything together, large spaces next to it. That was not successful.
Well, yes, that's it. But in that case, it is interesting. One of our companies was also involved with digital addressing, how they think about it and how it's built, especially sustainability with wind and solar has been really well thought out. It's not just about laying it down and the supply routes for the materials that need to come there. Let's not forget that the plan is from 10 years ago. The materials have sometimes doubled, sometimes tripled in value. Yes, we've seen it like that. Everyone also started laughing when a few Dutch people began spraying up an island in Dubai. It is now completely sold out. They are starting with the second 20-year-old one, which is larger than the first palm. It can now also be fully developed.
Absolutely. What strikes me about Saudi Arabia in this context, I don't know exactly where it comes from. The fact that the negotiations mean that Ukraine takes place in Jeddah naturally puts Saudi Arabia back on the world map. I suspect that is not entirely coincidental.
They are working on a new project in Jeddah, which is also being completely uplifted there.
And then the Americans and the Ukrainians probably didn't have much to say about it. But the fact that the Americans are going along with it also says something, I suspect. The United States and Saudi Arabia have, of course, always been closely connected. Perceptio veritas est, I always say, but in a bit of pseudo-Latin. The truth is really what you think it is, and they do that well, I think. Yes, to the detriment of Europe, by the way, because the discussions about Ukraine are not taking place in Europe. I know that in Brussels it is somewhat seen as a setback. They would have preferred those negotiations elsewhere.
Well, and that's also this week. This week, the US, of course, reiterated its support for Ukraine after that letter from Zelensky, in which he said thank you in at least 4 different ways, without actually apologizing for the fuss in the White House, without really saying thank you for providing support. It was a bit of a letter where you think, okay, this doesn't really come across. Oh, the heart has been overthought and overdone. Everything is patched together. Let's make something of it. Writing letters at the committee, more or less. Has it led to Trump restarting support towards Ukraine, the military in intelligence, in connections? Yes, it's another step.
Indeed. I even heard yesterday that Zelensky is welcome again at the White House. That shocked me.
This is yet another very strange way of negotiating. Yes.
Yes, once again, this is a classic standard operating procedure for this gentleman.
The feeling that grips me, it is interesting that now with those negotiations we end up with a ceasefire, yes, but that is negotiating with yourself. You can find it, the one who is really in charge of a ceasefire, that's the Russians. Well, but that's posturing too, which I think Trump can do like no other. Again, perceptio veritas est, we are the ones. Ukraine and the US, we want a ceasefire, and we are working on it. We are doing well, in short. And now it's up to those Russians. This morning Rubio goes on Friday. Today that is, because today we are of course going online, sitting here in Moscow if all goes well, or at least one of those negotiators. Witkov, I believe. Yes, what can those Russians say? If they say yes, then there will be a ceasefire. Then Ukraine will hopefully regroup a bit. The Russians, the latest reports I get at least, are that the Russians will be on the winning side. That Color's pocket is almost empty. They have almost regained it. A ceasefire. I don't know to what extent that would be strategically wise for Russia. If they don't, then of course the Russians are the bad guys again. Regardless of whether you think the Russians are the bad guys or not, we'll leave that discussion aside for now. But this is, in my opinion, another tactic by Trump to present himself as the peacemaker in a strategic position. And one way or another, I think he's always trying to come out on top, whether or not a ceasefire happens. And you might find Trump's stories annoying, but I don't think he's handling it clumsily.
Well, he did promise to, in a normal way, stop the bloodshed. He said it doesn't matter. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, let the bloodshed stop. Now, 30 days is quite short. I mean, you really don't achieve anything yet, not permanently satisfied with it. However, its primary merit lies in putting an end to the violence, a consensus we can universally acknowledge as imperative. Indeed, another report like that came up this week, and whether it's propaganda or something else. Russian officials, it turns out to be the women's team that he has to send gifts to the families of deceased soldiers. Sent meat grinders as a gift. Twister, yes, what do you call that? As a token of appreciation, according to The Guardian. Now, is that Western propaganda? But is it really, though?
Yes. Yes, guys, this is just a case of having nothing to write about, so we're going to nitpick. If you read the article carefully, and I also took a closer look at it, you'll soon discover that they themselves asked the widow what she wanted, and a number of women simply said they wanted a meat grinder because they needed one. Then the most awkward video of someone receiving such a meat grinder goes viral, of course, because she presents herself a bit awkwardly, which is understandable since it's an emotional moment, and then this label is attached to it. Yes, it is indeed a form of journalism that always makes me a bit queasy, because I think, yes, what you're doing now is worse than what happened there to those people.
That might be a bold statement, which is why we're in this lovely podcast.
I find him quite tasty and sharp.
The state of his journalism right now is completely one-sided, in my opinion.
Great interview with Arnie, Richard Olemans, who says we really need to stop looking at America, but also look at Russia through the Dutch and European lens. And it's a longer period. I've also lived in Africa in the 60s and 70s, and then you just see a lot of different news. In America, too. Sometimes it's quite a bit like, guys, come on, let's not have a child in the news in a one-sided way. Then you also hear occasionally, and this is also a typical example,
That it's a nice bridge, perhaps, to another point we should think about, and that is the rearming of Europe, the financial consequences of that.
Ford managed to get through World War II by producing tanks that we will soon be driving in a contraption with a rack and a tank turret on it.
Indeed, the Dutch military is already utilizing Volkswagen's Amarocks, which is happening in the context of gun rights.
Volkswagen became big during World War II anyway. I've read Nazi Billionaires. I highly recommend it. Then you will see what arming does for the industry apart from the ethical aspect. Let's first establish that there really weren't any beautiful things happening during that period, also by those tycoons who really thrived thanks to the war. As unpleasant as it is, because I'm a pacifist, so I always find armament a bit contradictory. I always think we're working in the wrong direction. Work might see it differently. For me, that's a bit how I see him. What I always see is, apart from the fact that I don't have my own feelings about it, it does offer a lot of opportunities for entrepreneurs and investors. I always try to see both sides of the coin, to include in such a piece of news.
Yes, let it be clear that soldiers, in general, are the greatest pacifists, you know. Yes, that is also my experience.
They, of course, established the NATO fund a few years ago. You can already see that quite a few startups are getting money from there as an important source of income. The NATO fund is now, of course, only being doubled and doubled because they are now getting much more capital. It was already $1 billion, and I believe it's now heading towards $5 billion. Let's be honest, the whole of Silicon Valley is built on 5-child semiconductors, which directly originated from World War II and the radar technology of that time. So, unfortunately, it is the case that a lot of innovation is caused by and after a war, but we hope we don't end up in that situation. It is indeed good that we have all been shaken awake and that we need to ensure our own armament. I hope that from the European Army, European Loan for European Defense, we will enter the rest of the European capital market, and that will only make Europe better and more important as a whole, because once again, as noted last week, Europe is still the #1 economy in the world. This includes all countries where GDP and GNP are combined. We aren't trained to handle being alone, but it's something we need to learn.
The Netherlands is awake. I have here a letter that we received yesterday from the Minister of Defense to the House of Representatives. March 12th, that is really very recent, in which financing bottlenecks are addressed regarding the defense industry in the Netherlands, solutions and action lines. Well, there you have it. The government has always been somewhat of an inflexible entity. There is an information asymmetry between demand and suppliers. But this letter particularly delves quite extensively into private investments in the defense industry, optimizing processes and removing practical barriers, especially the private sector, making it attractive for the private sector to ensure that we can also invest in the defense industry. That's really a big deal. Exit, literally.
And of course, deep tech requires much more capital. You can always spot a poor investor in deep tech if, during the first interview, they ask how much revenue you're generating, what your monthly recurring revenue is, because with deep tech, you've been working on it for 4, 5, 6 years before you can even generate any revenue from it. And those kinds of investors really don't exist, hardly in the Netherlands, let alone in Europe, let alone across the border. So this is a very good sign. Thank you, Rowan.
Well, interestingly, at point 3 on page 4 of that letter, it also mentions optimizing processes. Defense thus leaves the manta, the best product for the best price. So the procurement discussions that have often led to problems in recent years, where you buy cheaply and purely, to put it bluntly, are now being replaced by the timely availability and origin of the product. So where does it come from? Well, where the European origin of the products will become more important than the price and the quick delivery. And what is also very interesting, which I found very nice to read, is that the overly strict interpretation of ESG rules by financiers hinders the financing of the defense industry.
I thought that was the best part. I think, yes, break down those ESG rules. And if this leads to dismantling the woke environmental, social, and governance mindset that is prevalent nowadays, then I think we've already achieved a lot. because I notice in many investment companies that such things are almost led by a compliance department or by DIY or whatever you want to call it. And we need to return to common sense investments, investment solutions, and actions above all, instead of getting completely stuck in a compliance machine. The largest department has the most power within a pension fund, even just a small fund.
And what does the minister say? Defense encourages financiers to make room in their own investment policies when it comes to ESG rules. And it's quite funny, InvestNL wants to get into deep tech, but they also have to focus on ESG. So
Yes, it's quite amusing how the left hand and the right hand don't communicate with each other. But anyway, I think it's fantastic. I believe it's very good news for the innovation industry in the Netherlands and in Europe, especially deep tech. We'll come back to that shortly. I always make distinctions. Tough tech and fluffy tech, little platforms, the really nice e-commerce, the tough tech, where you really need the science for certain product solutions. That's fantastic. I really like that. We also started with venture work there. We love tough tech. And the more parties, especially from the private industry, that get involved, the better it is, because we do have this. Leave the fluffy tech to the Americans. Tough tech, we should definitely keep doing that in Europe. Well, that's a great argument, and I completely agree with it.
absolutely.
Well, the latest stays in the country. Tough tech is water. Tough tech is new energy, renewable energy. Tough tech is scalable food technology. And these are all areas where we, in Europe, and especially in the Netherlands, are very strong. Wageningen University has been the leading university in the world for years in agri and food tech. We hold the absolute second position as a food producer in the world after America, which is, of course, unprecedented for a small country by the North Sea with an extremely low CO2 footprint. And if you can just export that to other countries as agri-food as a service, then I think we found a new exchange model for the Netherlands. But also aqua, water technology, access to water, one of the biggest challenges worldwide. The Netherlands is also a leader in this. And if we can get that kind of long-term vision from the government guys, then we have something great.
I think so too. I think so too. You shouldn't see it as me dismissing the values behind environmental, social, and governance. Those values are also important. I mean, to address your point, Westerlink. Now, we have invested in a company that has a solution to take horticulture off gas for heating those greenhouses, but they do it through crypto mining because it generates heat. And it is still a cheaper and more efficient way to heat those greenhouses than using gas. Solutions like these fit naturally into the underlying principles of ESG, only those lower between people in the office with a large amount of paper and a procedure. That is the problem we are dealing with, and we truly need to move past it.
Let's focus on the problems that should be worthy for the betterment of people and planet. But please, let's not turn it into a compliance paper show, where we have to demonstrate that we also have double-layered toilet paper that is still recyclable.
I always notice that through the whole documenting process, so I come from education, a work advocate who has to document and safeguard everything. Nowadays, a teacher spends almost half of their annual workload putting on paper everything they do in class and with teachers and parents and stakeholders. So half of his work and his working life, imagine being a teacher for 40 years, you spend half of your life preparing reports for the education inspectorate on what you've done. This completely obstructs the actual results you could have achieved with that student or at that school. And the same applies to ESG in my view. Precisely because we want to secure everything we do in rules and compliance, we lose sight of the fact that we are solving a major problem. Because now we start micromanaging, doing all the little things right, but the big things we actually don't get the time and space for because we have to secure them. That's a lot of work again.
The reason why I actually class in REC TEG, if you combine AI and blockchain, then you can make an analysis based on AI of what you have done in the classroom that can ultimately be separated as evidence in blockchain technology so that it can no longer be altered. And in this way, you can actually create the compliance trail fully automatically to ultimately let the exchange model do what they are good at. And that is to focus on Paul and not on the rest.
Then you can start offering individualized education again. Then you can, per child, do nothing.
But this is also how I read the Minister of Defense, who says, okay, those ESG rules are there, but only within the existing rules that be. Use the rules very differently than has happened so far. Take the space is said without many words.
That is a political way of saying, hang them on the high tree because they are in the way. I really have to say that it is just a very political way of saying, please stop it. That's what I read.
That may be so, but the point is, I see that the lawyer, of course, also regularly sees that the interpretation of what the law says doesn't always have to be the law itself.
To be? Yes, that's what I mean. No, we as Dutch people have gone completely overboard. It's ingrained in our DNA that we always want to be the best behaved kid in the class. And when European and GDPR legislation comes, we create our own Dutch legislation that is even stricter and more focused on privacy. You see the same thing with the whole KYC and EML story. We are the ones who want to do it 100 times more properly than Spain, Italy, or Greece. Rabobank, I believe, now has more than half of its staff in the compliance department. They are scaring their own customers. If they ever make a wrong or just a foreign overbooking that their system recognizes as dangerous.
Yes,
I am in the thick of it.
Yes, you see, and that's a weekly occurrence for me. Yes, I do send things abroad now and then, but everything has to be justified. I just have a fixed checklist that I go through when I have someone from Rabobank or any other bank on the line. I bank with Rabobank myself, so that's why I use them as an example. You notice we want to be the best behaved kid in the class, while the rules, if you read them, because I know those rules quite well, also the ESG rules. The rules are quite manageable, but the way we're implementing them now often goes too far. I was with Roan in Amsterdam a while ago at the Benelux World Forum. They also discussed ESG there, and everyone said, yes, we'll just slap a label on it and do this and this and this. So they are, internally, they are very lenient with the legislation, and externally, they wag their finger. So I really see that we have a kind of double agenda towards the consumer. We are very strict. And internally, we try to manage with labels to regulate.
It's tough to uphold. I started a business when the Occupational Health and Safety Act was introduced. Finally, when you look at how it has been complied with and has been upheld, the entire Occupational Health and Safety Act is
an excellent, or perhaps not so excellent example, is the General Data Protection Regulation, which is the privacy law. If you interpret it literally, then you can hardly do anything, especially when you're in financial services or law, that kind of industry. Yes, so nobody keeps...
That's also such a nonsense point, Dirk, because you're really hitting on something there. All the funds we administer and assist in the company, for that, we must, as a fund, handle those personal data for 7 years retained. But on the other hand, the investor can request the deletion of that data. So then you have to remove it from the portal they see. And on the other hand, you still have to keep it. That's just...
is due to the bottlenecks, Roan, between the AWVG, the GDPR is then the European legislation, but the AWVG was sometimes simply the Dutch version, and the anti-money laundering legislation, the anti-money laundering and the KYC. Those two are completely at odds with each other, and every investor or lawyer or jurist or accountant encounters this.
I have done that once. I once made an inventory in the legal profession where a decent law firm must comply with to literally adhere to the general regulation on data processing in the GDPR. You then need a separate officer for that. And this is also happening in many firms. A GDPR officer, you have a KYC officer, a compliance officer, you have this and you have that. Before you know it, there's a lot involved in the work. It is a waterhead in supervision. Now, I'm not going to stand here as an advocate and argue that we should all just throw the law in the trash, because that's not how it works either. But I find it refreshing to see how much, even if it may be politically phrased, that the Minister of Defense at least now says, yes, we do have ESG. But guys, within the ESG legislation, there's actually a lot more possible than you think. Well, I think that's good. And especially against the backdrop of making Europe stronger, because I think that there, and I believe we all agree on this, America on one side, China, Russia on the other. Let's please, as a continent, take those 500 million or 450 million people who live here. Let's really become a bit more self-aware. We are a serious factor in the world. But at this moment, of course, still not. We're being walked over from all sides. I don't know who said that last. In America, 300 million people. In Russia, 150 million people here. 450 million people. And we ask America to protect us against those 150 million Russians. What is going wrong here? In that sense, I am now finding the initiatives to free up money for strengthening defense in Europe very good. On the other hand, I have some experience with that myself. If you order a tank now, from Rheinmetall or wherever, you'll be the first in 5 years. So we are a bit late with it.
Look, there is a reason we have always asked for American help. That also has a lot to do with what I think is the fighting spirit of the European. So I also see that our armies are not very well manned. He is doing his best. Yes, you are indeed doing your best. I think you see that too, that the resources are very thin. If you just look at it percentage-wise speaking, there have been many studies on what percentage of Americans are willing to fight for their country, while they are actually fighting for another continent. Then that percentage is significantly higher than if you ask a Spaniard or a Dutchman or an average Pole.
Yes, perhaps that is the advantage of a legal gun ownership policy, that everyone drives around there with a gun.
Also, a two-party political system, because then you still maintain nationalism, at least the national feeling, more cohesively, strangely enough. Despite the fact that you can have all sorts of opinions about those political movements, in my opinion, they are both pretty much the same. But at least they're both on the right side, whether you choose the Democrats or Republicans. It does make it easier than a highly fragmented system like we have in the Netherlands, and then on top of that, Europe. I mean, you can be for everyone with everyone having a different opinion. That naturally makes it difficult to create a sense of unity. And some countries do manage that.
It is certainly challenging to foster a feeling of national identity, much less a feeling of European unity.
Well, you know, I am still a Dutchman, but I think it's also quite a bit of indoctrination. You're softened and coddled there. Then, of course, you have to raise the flag and sing along with the crowd. It's quite a programming of the American. And I do think there's a certain link with legal gun ownership throughout America. That almost half of America just sinks, almost 3/4 of those present. Weapons, single-fire shotguns that are in circulation worldwide. I think that also has something to do with it.
But be careful, and it's also, you shouldn't generalize. I had a Polish client on the phone yesterday, then it also touched a bit on these themes. In Poland, it's different, you know. They are, of course, much closer to that eastern border. And they also say about us Poles, it's like, you in Western Europe, you really have no idea what's going on. And here that idea is much more strongly present. And you also see that Poland is currently the country within Europe, within the EU, with the strongest military. Who would have ever thought that? And you do see that in other countries in Eastern Europe as well, you know. And even in Scandinavia, it's all much more strongly felt.
I saw a projection stating that the GDP per capita in Poland will be higher than in Japan in 6 years. Is that so? That's intense. That's quite significant in Poland.
But from that perspective, you could say that the spending leads to a stronger economy because they are already aiming for around, what is it now? 5%. So from that perspective, and with a strong self-worth and identity, but they are also, of course, the country that admits the fewest refugees, the country with a geographically interesting location relative to the rest of Europe, a country that has always encouraged family expansion and hasn't really participated in a sort of semi-quasi one-child policy like we have here. The economy brings it here. We encourage people to have fewer children because it's too expensive. That naturally means that you have a healthy foundation of your own from which you can establish your own entity as a country. I think that's more difficult in other countries.
I think that plays a role. Having a common enemy is always a good idea for your own national sentiment. I suspect that the Russians in Eastern Europe still have something. Indeed, they are just more positioned on the doorstep.
You can't always keep that up. Look at North Korea. At some point, they get a bit fed up too. Your population?
I wouldn't count on that. What are the assumptions? The black hole, that country. But anyway, shall we move on to my favorite chapter? Innovation.
We move on to innovation, and maybe we've landed in Asia in that way, as I just mentioned with North Korea. Because the first step to spark innovation is, of course, always just new blood in the organization. And I found that beautiful about what was just mentioned, how now they are working with Chinese buyers for the Volkswagen factories in Germany, which Volkswagen wants to get rid of. That is certainly a particular direction to take that might not even be a bad one. I am just trying to say, I mean, if you look at what is coming out of Asia now with robots and such, then I am quite amazed. An example of that is, of course, simply the robots.
Super interesting. That's how we should also be in the competition, I think, because that's what China does too. You also bring German manufacturers to China, and you shouldn't see China as an enemy. Just look around your living rooms. How many things there come from there? I recently moved, and I find Bosch to be one of the most beautiful companies in the world. It is a steward-owned company. So they don't have shareholders, but have employees, a kind of foundation as management. And I think that's one of the most beautiful companies worldwide. I bought a lawnmower from there. Fortunately, it was made in Hungary, but I still had a brochure of the previous version, and that was made in China. There's also a bit of the market in that, but we just know that 90% of consumer goods come from China. Yes, we can be against it, but those people have now really gone through fantastic innovation. Also in robotics and electric cars. And let's be honest, competition due to the weather. This, however, is the best case for a strong Europe that is self-reliant and not dependent on anyone.
Europe, especially the Netherlands, has always been a bridge between East and West. The VOC, you have your opinions on how that was in those colonial relationships. Trade pigeons, that's what made us great. And I also find that the ridiculous anomaly at this moment of those wars that are currently happening, and trade wars that are now coming on top of that. Guys, let's trade. Doesn't everyone benefit from that? With China, and as far as I'm concerned, eventually with Russia again too. And America, everyone.
So when you bring in new people, it's the innovation you get out of it. Of course, we've just seen those robots, but you should look up online about dark factories. Just the whole idea of if you let everything be done by robots, why would the lights need to be on? You should see those videos. It's really absurd. Just completely dark factories where you only hear all those robots manufacturing. It's really next level. And if you build that in a Volkswagen factory, is creating. If you keep going with that, I think we are already a step ahead.
Correct.
And as a result, we, and especially the Germans, are forced to, let's be honest, Tesla has fully electric cars and disrupted the entire system around it. The Germans had to follow. China, of course, took a good look at that. And now they are also challenging Tesla again. You now have cars that can go around a beautiful example of an amphibious vehicle that is just as large as a Land Rover Discovery. Fully electric and can also rotate on its axis with a certain one motor per wheel system. So it can rotate on its axis. Those kinds of technologies, much better batteries, much faster to charge. Now Tesla has to step up again, and that's only a good thing, because ultimately innovation, competition drives innovation, and Europe must also be okay with that, and especially the Germans.
I find development in China interesting. For a long time, China was known as the country that produced junk, although it made the same things as the Western world, America and Europe, that the quality was inferior. They have developed that further over the last 50 years. What you have seen in recent years, DeepSeek, for example, is a great example of that. DeepSeek RI is better than the paid version of GPT, and it's completely free and open source. And you see that with those cars too. Electric cars are simply becoming better than a Tesla. When you look at the interior, when you see the finish, yes, I think that's a very nice development. They are no longer comparable to Europe and America. No, they are getting better. So it really becomes a challenger, forcing others to step up. That is indeed the dream of innovation.
Your favorite topic, Mark Wesseling, innovation. Yes, that naturally comes from context, from collaboration, from trade, from doing business with each other. Then I do wonder, what effects are Mr. Trump's trade wars going to have on those kinds of developments? It can't be very favorable, can it? I would say yes. And then I would say again, we as Europe chart our own course and make our own decisions.
But Mark, what did you think?
About Manus, I played with it, of course. I've been very involved with these kinds of tools, and I think it's fantastic. And with the AI. And see, we've been at it for 30, 40 years, especially the agents, the personalized agents. That will be a pleasure the same you'll just get soon. And yes, actually an AI assistant who knows exactly what you want, what you do, and what you see. And you just have to keep feeding it with your preferences. And that ultimately makes you much more efficient. I've always compared AI to an exoskeleton. As you may know, I walk a bit awkwardly.
What I find interesting about Manus is that it really goes a step further than all other AIs. An AI agent gives you a prompt and a task, and you have to keep feeding it. And what I have observed with Manus is he's back. Manus, you tell it what you want, and it will execute everything. So yes, it's almost fully autonomous. It can build entire websites. It can actually do everything on your computer that you can do yourself, and maybe even more, so you can. I find it dangerous to say, but you can let it run its course, if of course it is well programmed. Yes, but I know this is more in that space, but I found it very interesting to see that you don't have to give a prompt over and over again. I always say JGPT is a conversation, and this is just a hyper good A player who only needs 3 words.
For everyone who has ever made a course party, in Excel or in Word, now your dream is coming true. This can do everything with all kinds of different apps that you use yourself, and you can also repeat it and repeat at times as you want. So that makes it really beautiful to behold. Yes, absolutely.
Yes, well, that made me quite happy, and I truly can't repeat it enough times. Let us collaborate closely. Moreover, as Europe, we must not go back to one of the most significant regions of the globe.
Such a nice project. Really? Yes, 125 startups. At least startup owners who are no longer in that startup. Saying we are going to give Europe a startup community again, where we can truly thrive, where we can truly grow, where startups also provide 200,000 as startup capital, where they are helped and coached by those startup founders. Not by a coach who has never had experience with it, but really those startup founders, successful startup founders. I do think so. They have a video on LinkedIn. It really shows it well indeed that we are doing really great things in Europe. And I think that fits very well with Mark Wesseling's argument.
Yes, I think it's fantastic. It has been under the radar for a while. Of course, in the past 6 months, or in the past year, there has also been a lot about an initiative with limitations regarding the European INC, that we need to have a European activity. That is cross-border acceptable, just like a Delaware. 80% of companies in America are a Delaware, and we also need a version of that. We use it ourselves too. More based on a European corporate, but we just need to join forces. So many fantastic things are happening, but again, much more in deep tech, in science, tech. So many beautiful things are coming out of universities. They are crying out for people with experience in go-to-market strategies. They are coming from English universities, but also from European universities. Break times are so many beautiful things. Verizon is also an example of that. And Dorian Reactor, a few guys from Delft are behind it, including France. Because France, of course, has high density with nuclear energy. WestNL is going to invest in it. Verizon, or the European Investment Program too, to see that we bring that kind of mini reactors or beautiful technology from European universities to the market, and finally just join forces, including France and the Netherlands in that case.
I think it's really cool, and it fits perfectly with what we happened to say last week. Of course, about new energy forms. But 200 million is still nothing at all for building such a startup.
Of course not. It hasn't been built yet. It still needs to be tested. We are still in the testing phase, but the fact that it is being pushed not only by the Dutch government, but also by the French government is a good sign. I don't forget that ASML wouldn't have existed if the Dutch government hadn't invested in it during the startup phase. And I can name dozens of other companies with that tech background because we lack the private sector. Those willing to invest in tech, a lot of funds, they simply have a maximum time span of 10 years. Yes, tech is just too slow for that. Very simple.
But isn't it also that we break it down from an incentive? Isn't it that we also break it down from an incentive? Let's make it very small. Throughout Europe, you had those schemes where if you invested in a startup, you had a tax advantage. And if you then lost it, you could also deduct it. Nowadays, if you've invested in a startup and you lose it, you might even get a tax bill. That it is not seen as a gift or the like, that's where we should be heading.
We used to have the grace loan before.
A genuine loan of grace.
And in England, they've had the CIS and IJS for years, and it doesn't yield many positive things because you often see that the reason an investor invests in a startup is for a tax deduction. Well, that is by far the worst reason to invest in a startup. So you also get a lot of fluffy tech companies that suddenly get funded by a few investors looking for tax benefits, who really end up screwing over their colleagues by people who don't actually know what they've invested in, but are only interested in a tax benefit. Not good either.
Thus, you are essentially saying that we will only pursue investments that are efficient. The non-efficient ones we should just not undertake, which, in my opinion, leads to risk aversion. Because there was a good example a few weeks ago where a young man had support from family and friends, especially family, had borrowed money to start his business. Okay, in my opinion, completely the wrong industry. The restaurant industry. Because I mean, if you want competition anywhere, start a restaurant. Ultimately, it didn't work out. What did that lead to? Until those parents all received a gift tax assessment. Because it was then considered a gift. Yes, that's just a bit of a kick in the teeth for trying to add something to this economy. I can't do that then.
If these entrepreneurs had informed themselves from experienced entrepreneurs, he would have structured it differently, and everyone could have simply deducted it from their income. This is purely due to the young man in question, who did not properly inform himself through other experienced entrepreneurs on how to structure this deal, because otherwise there really would have been nothing wrong.
Yes, but does it have to be that difficult? My point is more. I agree with you, Mark. But does it have to be so difficult that you first have to get past the hopium you have when starting a startup? Do you first have to apply German thoroughness before you just start? Because ultimately a startup is just about starting, just like how we started this podcast. And our first one already had more than 1,000 views across all platforms last week. But we just started, and it can always be better. And from the idea that we make mistakes and we'll see how it goes.
No, agreed. But approaching it from a one-man business is never the right plan, I think. If you do a bit of Googling on the internet, how to start a business in the Netherlands, you'll already get 3 tips. And if you just stick to those 3 tips, then there's nothing to worry about. Mind you, we established a limited company within 24 hours for €1 against approximately 450 euros in costs. That is true. That is certainly the case. That is indeed.
I wanted a city capital, and that can be done right away. And indeed, that knowledge is sometimes lacking. But I think Rowan's point is, why does it always have to be so difficult in the Netherlands? And why are we more often held back than encouraged to show entrepreneurship and be innovative?
So how do you experience that with everyone you meet? And I mean, you also give guest lectures at schools and always focused on cash flow. Well, entrepreneurship is one of the easiest ways to ensure that you turn the talent you received for free into a total balance. How do you encounter that?
In 2006, I started as a teacher of entrepreneurship in education. You could clearly see that everyone wanted to become an entrepreneur. You notice that in the last, what are we talking about, almost 20 years, that motivation to just start something for yourself. Apart from drop shipping and all sorts of other things, I hardly hear anymore that they really want to build an innovative company. Whereas 20 years ago, that was much more common. In vocational education, people were much more creative than they are now. Now they just want to get rich quickly. At the University of Applied Sciences, where I occasionally gave a talk, you just notice that people have kind of fallen back into the narrative. Just stick to your studies and aim for a well-paid job, because then at least you have some security. So they are also somewhat scared by teachers due to all the uncertainty in the world and all the regulations, that it is so complicated in the Netherlands to successfully run a business. And I think that sentiment, especially when you look at education, I find that quite concerning. It's not necessary at all. The startups we encounter and the pitches we hear.
Amazing things come my way. What can I say? I notice incredible things emerging when I watch pitches. You could see natural selections within that. S. Wesselink actually says, but yes, is it then a more efficient market? Well,
I see that especially the technical people come up with more great product ideas. Mark and I were just talking about it yesterday. What I miss a bit is that real entrepreneur, that creative red figure or yellow, that they just want to go for it, that they can really sell the product well, and that they are not the technician who is completely in love with their product. Mark and I unfortunately see that quite often. So the cool ideas, let's make that clear. I also see beautiful things passing by, but most just fall off because it's just a technician who is in love with their own product, and they actually can't present it well. So they get a lot of middle funding because they can't sell, because the first thing they do with that funding is marketing and sales. Almost 90% of all pitches I receive are, we have a super cool idea, but we can't sell it. Then you're just an employee.
Directly the result of the choice we once made, education, to split the technical universities from the business universities. I think that England and America are doing much better. Germany as well by now. If you look at Zangale and Parshof, universities that simply mix business and tech together. Fortunately, there are some initiatives. Erasmus has done well with Yes Delft and collaboration. I see that the University of Twente is also getting better at this. People who mix much more with information science. More and more exciting things are happening, but we still have a lot more to do. You must, of course, bring business and product together as quickly as possible.
I do indeed think Delft is a very good example, but yes, we can't just rely on Delft.
well, actually much simpler. You need to meet those people at the university. You need to interact with them, build friendships, and think, wow, we're going to build something together in a shed. That synergy is very difficult if you're not in the same ecosystem. But anyway, I think we'll leave it at that for this week. Thank you all very much once again. Mark Wesselink, good luck with your appointments in Amsterdam. Soens, great to have you with us again. Mr. Cashflow and Dirk live from Rotterdam at his law office, and I from home. I hope to have you all on the podcast again next week. Don't forget to like, share, and follow for next time. And with your notifications on, just see us again next week around the same time. Thank you all.
Goodbye.